Mesu was looking at the newspaper, which was posted on a board outside of a building. Rosemary walked up and said, "Good morning, Mesu." Mesu said the same. Mesu asked Rosemary when the next edition of the newspaper was coming out. Rosemary said, Tuesday. Right now we're only doing 2 episodes a week, but they hope to start doing a week like the New York Times. I mean, the Herald. Rosemary walked off in a seemingly good mood. Mesu looked back at the board and it said, "The hit and run suspect still at large." Lucas and Henry met on the side of the street. Henry asked him had he been to the Founder, which I guess is the building. I mean the job site. And Lucas said, "No, I haven't been that way. I've been a little busy." Henry said, "Anything particular?" Lucas said, "A little this, a little that." Henry said he read Elizabeth's book, and he said if the character Mr. Gaines is based off him, he thinks he falls short. Lucas said, "Oh, you know, Elizabeth thinks highly of you, and so does a lot of other people in this town." Henry said, "Be that as it may, but I read Elizabeth's book. Reading the book gave me a moment of clarity, and I believe I'll be staying with the company. That is, if the investors decide to accept the offer." Elizabeth called Florence from Rosemary and Lee's home. She wanted to know if Robert could be spared so he can babysit because the regular babysitter was sick. Florence said that Robert was sick too, so that couldn't happen. When Florence got off the phone with Elizabeth, she went over to the counter where Mr. Yost was, and she was telling him that Elizabeth doesn't have a babysitter, and she was thinking about volunteering to be the babysitter. Mr. Yost let her know that without Robert there, somebody has to deliver the mail, and while that's happening, somebody has to be at the counter, so they can't do that. And she said, well, maybe you're right. But while they were having this conversation, Lucas was in front of them. He was listening. He didn't say anything. He was just listening. The next scene, Lucas was knocking on Elizabeth's door, and when she opened it, he said, "You rang?" She said, "No, but I'm glad to see you." He said, "I heard from Florence that you need somebody to watch little Jack." She said, "Yes. You have anyone in mind?" He said, "Me." She reluctantly said, "Well, if you're sure." He said, "I am." Rosemary sent Lee to interview the new mayor, Mayor Hickam. Lee asked him what would he say is his first order of business as the new mayor of Hope Valley. Mike said, "Well, as you know, I ran on fire safety. And your platform was," and Lee interrupted him and said, "progress," and explained what it was all about. And Mike said, "That's right." Mike said, "And Bill Avery's," and Lee buzzed in and said, "was about preservation," and explained what that was about. Mike said those were darn good platforms. Then he and Lee began to look at each other, and Lee said, "Okay." So that meant Mike doesn't really have an order of business yet. Joseph and Minnie were sitting at the cafe, at a table at the cafe, and they were talking about Joseph's work. He's working for Lee. He's doing a lot of bookkeeping and stuff. And Joseph says that he's doing more work than he expected to do. And he's been considering asking for a raise, or maybe him selling him a part of the business. Minnie said, "But doesn't that mean even more work?" And then he said, "Well, at least I'll be working for myself." Minnie said, "I understand. With Clara gone, I've been thinking about me in this cafe." Minnie said, "You were right when you said what's important is that we're here now." Joseph said, "You can't change the past. Let's just focus on building our future." Mr. Landis came to the school for a district visit. Elizabeth told him that she went to Hamilton and she she tested and received her certification to teach Angela. Mr. Landis said, I am so sorry, but we can't recognize accreditation outside of the district. I'm afraid your certification is worthless. Mr. Landis went inside the school and he was sitting in the corner writing. Cooper went up to Elizabeth's desk and told her his pencil broke. So she gave him another pencil. And while he was up there, he whispered to Elizabeth, I don't like him. She said, who? And he kind of shook his head toward Mr. Landis. Elizabeth said, Mr. Landis? He said, yes, ma'am. She said, well, we can discuss that later. For right now, head on back to your seat. Nathan was in the store asking Ned to return his hat because it was too big. As he was in there, May Sue walked in and Nathan said, I was just coming to see you. I wanted to ask you to dinner to thank you for helping me and Newton. She said, no need, Nathan. It was my pleasure. Ned walked up and he was looking at them both. May Sue said, what about the saloon? Tonight. Nathan said, I'll see you there. May Sue handed Ned the latest pharmacy invoices. He said, oh, thank you, May. And she walked out the door. Nathan watched her walk out the door. Ned watched her walk out the door with a smile on his face. Ned and Nathan looked at each other, and Nathan said, do not mention this to Florence. Ned said, not a word, Nathan. Mr. Landis and Elizabeth were arguing on the school steps, and he was saying with the influx of students, and Elizabeth cut him off and said, well, until the influx of students come in, this school is still under my control. This is still my school under my authority. Please leave. He walked into the school to get his papers and his hat. He reached for his hat and it was stuck. The children started giggling. Elizabeth looked bewildered. She looked at him and she looked at the children. He ripped the hat from the table and said, look at this. You see what your students have done? The children were still giggling. Mr. Landis said, who's ever responsible for this should be ashamed. He was getting ready to repeat that statement and Elizabeth jumped in and said, as you said, Mr. Landis, these are my students. I will handle this matter. Mr. Landis walked out the school. May Sue walked into Bill's office and hired him to be her attorney. Bill said, how can I help? She said, I'm a fugitive of sorts from my husband. Bill said, husband? She said, it's confusing. You might want to take notes. Lucas passed by Rosemary and Lee. He said he was on his way to take Elizabeth dinner. And Wyman Walden came in and he said that he needed to talk to Lucas. And Lucas said, it'll have to wait. And Walden said, it can't wait. Lucas said, well, after you. As they walked away, Rosemary said, you don't think Lucas is getting entangled with Walden, do you? Lee said, no, he's too smart for that. Rosemary said, of course he's smart, but he's behaving awful beholden. Lucas had fallen asleep on Elizabeth's couch after dinner. Elizabeth walked over to him and whispered, I love you. Then she woke him up saying, it's getting late. Lucas agreed to come back tomorrow and babysit little Jack again. After their kiss goodnight, Elizabeth closed the door and somebody ran and knocked Lucas down on the ground and socked him in the eye. The next morning, Lucas knocked on Elizabeth's door. She opened and said, Lucas, your eye, what happened? He said, I ran into a door. She didn't believe him, but he wouldn't explain. Elizabeth was addressing the class, and she said she was hoping that whoever is responsible for gluing Mr. Landis's hat to the table would come forward on their own. And Cooper raised his hand and admitted he was the one. With Cooper's parents beside him, Elizabeth told him, I want you to know I'm proud of you for admitting it was you. He said, yes, ma'am. I'm not sorry. Elizabeth said, and why is that? He said, because Mr. Landis does nothing but make trouble for everyone, especially you and Angela. Joseph said, I appreciate you wanting to help your sister, Mrs. Thornton, and your classmates, but you only cause more trouble. Cooper said, at least I did something. Minnie said, that doesn't make it right. Elizabeth said, Mr. Landis and I will do our best to solve our problems, but that is not going to happen until we respect one another. Cooper said, I'd still do it all over again. Joseph and Minnie looked at each other and then at Cooper. Joseph said, I'm sorry to hear you say that. We'll talk about this more at home. Right now, you need to know you need to replace that man's hat. Cooper said, what for? Mimi said, hush. Minnie said, hush. Joseph said, you can earn money working with me. As far as Mrs. Thornton, that's up to her. Cooper said, you'll never understand. Joseph said, I'm trying to, and I'll always be here if you want to explain. Minnie said, thank you, Elizabeth. And they got up and walked away. Cooper turned around and ran to Mrs. Thornton and hugged her and said, I'm sorry if I made trouble for you, Mrs. Thornton. Lucas walked up to Mr. Walton and one of the Pinkerton men. He said, gentlemen, if you intend to send me some kind of message to try and intimidate me, I'm fine with that. But I'm warning you both not to go anywhere near Mrs. Thornton and her son. Mr. Walton and the Pinkerton man just looked at each other and back at Lucas, and they just smiled. They didn't say a word. Nathan asked Lucas, is there a problem? Lucas said, no, everything's peachy. Elizabeth arrived home and she had a note waiting from Lucas saying, please join us for ice cream in town. All of a sudden there was a ringing sound. She looked around the house and she said, hello, just out in the air, hello. Then she saw the phone and she went over and answered it. It was Florence testing the phone to make sure it was ringing right. She said Lucas had the phone installed. When Elizabeth met up with Lucas, she said, Lucas, I don't want a telephone. He said, all right. She kept explaining that the phone would be a constant interruption and all the reasons she didn't need a phone. While he wasn't saying anything, he said he'll have it taken out. And she stopped and looked at him. He said he would take it out. She said, you will? And then he said, yeah. And then she continued to say why she didn't need a phone. And he said, I didn't ask. He said, it's your house. I fully respect that. Lucas gave her some ice cream. And then she said the ice cream was good. And then she said, on the other hand, why don't you wait on having the phone taken out? He said, whatever you say. She said it could come in handy. He said, especially in an emergency. She said, you're being awfully agreeable. He said, that's the way I like to argue. She said, are we arguing? He said, well, that's up to you. And they smiled at each other. Minnie and Joseph were sitting outside talking about they need to get to the bottom of whatever is bothering Cooper, which I thought they got to the bottom of that last week because he said, why didn't he go blind instead of Angela? But maybe it's something else. But while they were sitting there, a car drove up with front end damage. Joseph stood up and said, excuse me, sir, is this your car? The guy got out and closed the door and kept walking like he didn't hear Joseph talking to him. Joseph said, I noticed some damage to the front of your car here. And the guy started running, and Joseph started running after him. He said, wait. Rosemary and Lee and the Yosts were in the office talking about crossword puzzles, and Rosemary heard the commotion outside, and she looked that way out the window, and she went to investigate. Joseph had the man jacked up and was walking him toward the jail. Cooper was walking behind, yelling. Paul caught the man who hit Mountie Nathan. caught him all by himself.